I'm about as real as they come.
All my beats tailored by Joe.
House Digital.
Maserati Rick in Detroit, convertible bird in Miami. Graduated summa cum laude, strip club made a tsunami. Carlton Hines with the ball game, Grateful Edmonds with the snowflakes, Craig Pettis in the M-Town, Sal Magluta with the boat game, Falcone with the cocaine, like Freeway Ricky with the plug game, like Monster Cody in South Central, Larry Davis from close range.
These labs is this mixed with hydrochloric acid, which is again in one of these others, creates hydrogen cyanide gas is what they use in the gas chamber. So if you accidentally break one of these bottles and mix with it, instant death.
I believe that that's what happened to Suge. You know, he cut Harry off. You know, Harry was his advisor. You know, Harry set that whole play up.
Yeah.
From jail.
Although I heard it was someone else.
They set the play up?
I heard that Harry was a middleman. I heard there was another
For the
guy.
money.
Yeah.
He was a middleman for the money.
The money.
I was there when the money walked through the door.
The money came from this other guy.
I know him.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Can we say his name?
You can. I don't know if you want his name mentioned.
We mentioned his name before.
Have we?
Yeah, well, I have. Let's look it up. We know something. I can't find it. Fuck it. Anyways, there was another guy that actually
he
put
was
up.
a money guy. I'm saying the brains behind it
Was Harry-O.
But
There was a money guy that actually put up all the cash.
Yeah.
He ended up going to prison afterwards.
No, he was in prison when.
He was in prison.
For months, drug officials have been warning about the dangers of the chemical PCP, an hallucinogenic drug popular particularly with the young. But the House Narcotics Committee heard today that more than 14% of the population between the ages of 18 and 25 has used it at least once, and that its use is on the upswing. Barry Seraphin reports.
Members of Congress, federal and local authorities were unanimous in their sharp warnings about PCP, sometimes called angel dust. Cheap and easy to manufacture, offering enormous profits to dealers, producing a floating euphoric high, it can also, they said, produce severe disorientation, violence, and psychotic behavior for days or even weeks. California Congressman Norman Mineta from San Jose, the major PCP center, listed some horror stories.
One man murdered his parents, another stabbed a tiny baby to death, another ripped out his own eyes with his own hands. Users themselves die not only from massive overdoses, but also from what is called, quote, behavioral toxicity, unquote. People fall from great heights, burn to death, drive their cars into large stationary objects, or drown in a few inches of water because they couldn't recognize the danger or couldn't cope with it, or simply because they were too high to do anything about it, even more.
PCP can be smoked, snorted, or taken orally. Authorities estimate that nearly 7 million Americans have tried it, most of them 12 to 25 years old. Officials are baffled by the widespread use of PCP in view of the potential risks, but some witnesses said the danger itself might be part of the appeal to young people.
The very fact that it is risky is for many youngsters appealing in the same sense that driving a motorcycle at 90 miles an hour may be appealing for the very element of hazard.
One teenage former user told the committee he turned to PCP because of peer pressure, personal problems, and boredom with marijuana.
It really numbed me. Right after I had smoked it, I felt really numb. I had really lost my senses, more or less. Even if I touched things, like I almost walked into a fire and it really, it didn't matter.
Manufacturing and distributing PCP has been seen as mainly an amateur operation, but officials said today that large, well-organized heroin traffickers are now involved. Witnesses said veterinarians and researchers have some limited, legitimate uses for PCP, but Congress is considering tightening controls on it and on some of its principal ingredients. Barry Seraphin, CBS News, Washington.
Yo, we back. She got Popalot. We headed to Compton on MOBB business. Now, today we are going to be covering one of the most elusive, one of the most mysterious, and based on my research, one of the most richest players to come out of the game in the 1980s, 1990s, and a person that I would say doesn't get nearly half enough credit for bringing us one of, if not the most iconic record label to come out of the state of California, Death Row Records. And that person that I'm talking about is going to be a guy by the name of Patrick Johnson, or Fat Pat. Now, when you start to do a list or the names of big dogs to come out of the state of California, like if you was trying to put a Mount Rushmore together, you're probably going to start at names like Tootie Reese before you get to names like Rick Ross or Harry O, or even Ray Ray Browning, Stanley Peanut Head Bryant, Honcho Day. The list just goes on and on and on. And I really feel like the guy that we're covering today rarely gets mentioned. But I'm going to do my best to make an argument of how they made a dent in the game just as much as some of the names that we mentioned previously. Now, the first case in my argument is going to be the lane that Patrick Johnson was in. Now, if anybody knows LA before the crack shift in the mid-1980s and the 1990s, PCP was going to be the drug of choice, as you can still find it being used by people in the state. I kind of want to say that PCP got its popularity in the United States from the state of California, but it also has taken off in other cities like Washington, D.C. is one I can think. Baltimore is another city where I know they get wet at. But I would consider California the headquarters for PCP. And during that time when PCP was the drug of choice, Patrick Johnson was one of the primary suppliers where you could have went to go get it. And just like some of the other drug traffickers would go on to align themselves with certain sets, like Harry would do with the Bounty Hunter Bloods, or Ray Ray Browning would do with the Pasadena Denver Lane Bloods, or even Freeway Ricky Ross with the Hoover Crips. Pat Johnson would go on to align himself with the Compton Corner Pocket Crips, and he would go on to make a run in the city never seen before in the PCP game. Johnson would go on to rack up multi-millions, and he wouldn't be noticed by the government until November 1988, where while under surveillance, agents would capture him and several of his associates loading up vans with boxes. When the vans would be stopped near the Mexican border, the boxes would go on to contain about $1.6 million in U.S. currency. Now, if anybody ever been through something like this, y'all get in the comment box. But just like with most cash seizures, I'm sure the government would go on to confiscate the cash as well as document the people that was in possession of it so they can go back to the office and do their homework. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Pat Johnson, because it would take nearly 2 years before authorities would execute search warrants at his and his associates' residence on June 23, 1990. And it would be during the search of his sister's residence where they would find buried under concrete and tile on a patio a safe that contained $1.5 million. During the course of the investigation of Patrick Johnson, they would identify one of his co-conspirators as a person by the name of Lula Metz. Now, Lula Metz would be very important because authorities would allege that Patrick Johnson would use a large portion of the profits that he made from his PCP organization to invest in businesses and purchase commercial properties. And authorities would allege that Lula Metz's role in that scheme would be converting the dirty money into cashier checks that were purchased in a structured manner. Those checks going on to purchase properties under Patrick Johnson's name as well as Lula Metz. Now, 8 other people would end up being charged in this conspiracy along with Patrick Johnson's sister, his girlfriend, where most of them would go on to plead guilty to money laundering and narcotics offenses. Lula Metz would end up being found guilty of money laundering and sentenced to 15 years in prison, with Patrick Johnson allegedly being the big dog operation that spanned 9 states that included Honolulu. He would end up being sentenced to 30 years in prison, but also being fined a whopping $8 million. Now, after hearing those numbers, it made me very, very curious. And that same $8 million that he was fined in 1991 is worth $16.5 million today in 2023. So that should tell you the scale of the operation that he was running. I only can remember out of all of the mob tie subjects that I covered, one person having to find bigger or as big, and that was going to be Samuel Baby Sam Edmonds out of Brooklyn. And I'm not even sure if it was this high. It might have been. But if nothing else I told you about Patrick Johnson in this episode explains the amount of money that he would go on to make in the game, you don't have to look any further than a federal probe that the government had in 1997, where they would go on to allege that Patrick Johnson, as well as Harry O, were the main funders behind the iconic record label. In most common circles, Harry O is mentioned as the main funder, but as years would play out, it seems like Harry O is more the brains of the operation, but Patrick Johnson was the pockets. I have seen several interviews with guys like Rick Ross and Reggie Wright Jr., where they said that Patrick Johnson was released sometime in the mid-2000s, and he's home, he's doing good, he's out making movies, he's kind of laying low, but we want to send a salute to him. He kept his mouth shut, he came home, turned his life around, and he's one of the main people behind, like I said, one of the most iconic record labels to come out of the state of California. Now, y'all make sure y'all hit the red subscribe button right under this video. Y'all get in the comment box. Y'all let me know what gangsters we missed, what cities we haven't been to, what stories we got to tell, what we got wrong, all of that. Y'all make sure y'all follow me on Instagram, on Twitter, POP_A_LOT. And I'm going to be back with some more real trill spill shit ASAP. Sugar Pop. Mob Gang.